Around 4:45 a.m. on the morning of January 17, 2017, 911 operators received a disturbing call from a man at a commercial waste station in Bronx County, New York. He claimed he had discovered several human body parts. It appeared to be a human female leg attached to a torso. The victim was initially only known as an African American Jane Doe. Who was this poor victim, and who was the monster who had murdered her and desecrated her remains? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Upon arrival at the sorting and weighing station facility, police officers immediately began to identify trucks who had deposited trash in the hour preceding. Officers soon learned that one of the numbers associated with the disposal of the human remains was a registered sex offender. The person's address was also linked to a 911 call made from inside the residence the night before. At 11:36 p.m. on the night of January 16th, operators had received a call from an unidentified female who claimed to have been sexually assaulted. Law enforcement soon identified a commercial trash hauler, Rasheen Stanley, who had disposed of the woman's body. He was brought in for questioning and was charged with concealing a corpse. Rasheen Stanley alleged that his life had been threatened. He would quickly become the prosecution's star witness, as he would lead law enforcement to their murder suspect. Investigators carefully tracked the movement of trash receptacles within the area. They soon located the victim's arms, which appeared to have been cut off at the hands at a different trash station in Kearney, New Jersey. The day after finding the initial gruesome discovery at the trash facility in Bronx, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Gray of the Bronx County District Attorney's Office applied for a trap and trace warrant on the suspect. This was used to obtain exact cellular location data to help locate him. On January 20, 2017, officers of the NYPD's Violent Felony Apprehension Squad arrived at the target location to arrest and bring into custody the man they believed was responsible for this heinous crime. As officers approached the apartment and rang the doorbell, the suspect escaped through the rear door. They were now in pursuit of a killer. Upon entering the residence, Detective Skolsky noticed what appeared to be blood on the front door and across one of the walls in the living room. He also observed a large white stain on the wooden floors that indicated where bleach may have been used. Homicide detectives caught up with the suspect in the hallway and handcuffed him. They collected the keys of a white Lexus GS350 sedan from his person. Inside the apartment, they found a silver LG phone, which had been assigned the same number from which the 911 call had been made 4 nights earlier. The next day, Detective Ernest Dorvell applied for search warrants for the known residence of their murder suspect, the LG phone, and the Lexus. NYPD officers returned to the target location the next day with their warrant. When investigators opened the door of a standalone freezer, they discovered more human body parts inside. There were hands, feet, and a young African-American woman's head. Upon one of the victim's feet was the tattooed name, Samori. Their suspect was identified as 40-year-old Samori Moses of Brooklyn, New York. The victim was confirmed to be his live-in girlfriend, 32-year-old Leondra Foster. Initially held on concealment of a corpse and tampering with evidence, the district attorney was motivated to increase the charges to murder. The medical examiner determined that both the remains from the waste stations and inside the freezer belonged to the same victim. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Samori Moses was arraigned on one count of second-degree murder and one count of concealment of a human corpse. He was held without bail, awaiting trial. The murder investigation was led by NYPD Detective Adam Kreetzberg of the 41st Precinct and Detective Christopher Skolsky of the Bronx Homicide Squad. The trial began on October 30, 2019, and lasted about 3 weeks. Samori Moses' defense counsel argued several key points that showed evidence of his not killing Leondra Foster. Samori Moses took the stand in his defense, testifying to his version of the sequence of events that led to Leondra Foster's death and dismemberment. His attorney, Julie Clark, outright asked him, "Be blunt about what you do for a living." Samori Moses declared himself a gangster pimp who had been in the game of women, money, and drugs for almost 20 years. He stated to the courtroom that he doesn't like good girls. He doesn't date any woman who's not a prostitute. These initial statements painted the victim in a less favorable and relatable light. They immediately planted a seed within the jurors' minds of the victim being less valuable, maybe even blameworthy to an extent, for what happened to her, since she was a known prostitute and was fully aware of the dangerous lifestyle she led. According to Samori Moses, the two had met at a party held at the social club Boss Rollers about 2 months after his most recent release from prison. The club was later revealed to have ties to the solicitation of sex workers, and many of its members were pimps, although Samori Moses denied having any knowledge of that. His reputation for being so important to others at the parties, according to him, was made obvious to Leondra, who was impressed by him. Leondra ended up going home with him that night instead of the man she had attended the party with. By his admission, Leondra, being a sex worker and he a pimp, created a complicated, often volatile relationship between the two, which involved a lot of substance abuse and intimate partner violence. According to Samori Moses, Leondra Foster showed him her way to solicit clients by using Backpage, which was a website for prostitution and other dark world activities. Samori Moses claimed that he expressed apprehension about how she lured in these clients because she was naive to the dangers of the world. Lily, as he referred to her, was too big-hearted for her own good and would even allow people to stay at their shared apartment. This led to many conflicts, which often escalated to violent behavior shown by him. He admitted to the courtroom, "I smacked Lily around. I caused some black eyes." On the night of her death, Leondra Foster faced his violent side once more. She had failed to inform him that one of her clients, a man with a foot fetish, was coming over to their apartment. Samori Moses had supposedly been passed out in their bedroom after having taken several ecstasy pills and was floating in and out of consciousness. Then he suddenly awoke to strange, disturbing sounds coming from the other room. He described it like a whacking or squishing sounds. Then he claimed to hear her scream, and then the scream became muffled. This pulled Samori Moses completely out of his drug-induced daze, and he flew into the other room, carrying his gun. He attacked the man who was hurting Leondra, punching him in the ribs, hitting him on the back of the head, and stomping at him. Then he stole the man's money and threw him out of their apartment. Once the man was gone, his anger focused on Leondra instead. He struck her across the face 4 or 5 times. Afterwards, Leondra went into the shower. While Samori Moses was on the phone with a friend, he heard a series of thuds coming from the bathroom. When he opened the door, he found Leondra slumped over in the tub. He said that he pulled her back up, but she kept slipping back into the tub. Her head smashed against it, causing a large wound to the back of her head. Then Leondra began to seize. Moses Googled what could cause such a reaction because he had never seen a seizure before. He claimed that he did this to help her, but he chose not to call 911 since he feared he would be the one to blame, and he was not going to return to prison. Leondra Foster died soon after. His attorney, Julie Clark, argued throughout the criminal trial that the victim, Leondra Foster, had been high on methamphetamines during the hours before she died, and the assault had been perpetrated by one of her clients, not the defendant. Since Samori Moses was a pimp and had various illegal items in his apartment, specifically his gun and cocaine, he elected not to involve the police in his affairs. According to the defendant, he didn't kill Leondra Foster, and he didn't realize she was going to die. Samori Moses declared his innocence and his love for Leondra, telling the jury, "We had arguments. We acted like children. We were in love." Instead, he opted to cut up his girlfriend, whom he claimed to love, with a knife and a saw. According to Samori Moses, once he dismembered her into 9 parts, he contacted a longtime acquaintance of his, Rasheen Stanley, who worked in commercial trash disposal. He was the same individual whom the police had identified as the man who had tossed her headless torso with one leg in at the weigh station in the Bronx. When the prosecution's key witness, Rasheen Stanley, testified how the defendant had threatened him with violence if he didn't help dispose of Leondra for him, he said that this wasn't the first time he had been a victim of Samori Moses' rage. When Samori had first moved to his block in the neighborhood, he had made some comments about what he was wearing. When Rasheen began to walk away, Samori Moses choked him out. He hit him, grabbing a glass bottle, and swung it at Rasheen's head, leaving him with a permanent scar. Samori Moses disrupted these allegations that he had threatened Rasheen, telling the jury, "Growing up in the ghetto, your friends are usually the guys you fight." The two men had grown up together, and they attended the same high school. Samori Moses claimed that when he contacted Rasheen for help, he was more than willing to. He didn't have to threaten him. The defendant held back his tears as he talked about how he wouldn't threaten his old friend. Also known as the gangster pimp Sugar Bear, Samori Moses did what he did best and weaved a tale of lies, hoping the jury would believe him over the strong evidence against the contrary. His attorney, Julie Clark, further insisted that her client would not do anything to intentionally harm his own business, stating to the jurors, "He's a businessman, and I submit to you that a businessman does not like to lose money." Assistant District Attorney Medini first addressed the glaring mistake in his story regarding his state while under the influence of the drug ecstasy. Samori Moses had claimed that he had been passed out, but ecstasy is an upper, not a downer. He answered that he had been up for a few days. The world looked like a cartoon to him and he was about to crash. Next, the prosecution introduced a series of texts that revealed the very violent nature of their relationship. In these texts between Leondra Foster and Samori Moses, she called him out for how he had beaten her with a belt, placed a bag over her head, and locked her inside a closet, in addition to a realm of other violent acts committed against her. Other texts revealed how the defendant had called Leondra a snitch, a rat, said he would close her eyes forever, and threatened to get her. The prosecution also addressed how even though he claimed she had been involved in sex work before they even met, the evidence of the escalating violence demonstrated how he had forced her to do it. The prosecution also pointed out how Samori Moses' story about how she died didn't add up. D.A. Medini asked him if he didn't want to involve the police, why he didn't just call a friend to help instead, but no, the defendant instead sat there, watching the woman he claimed to love and was planning to marry violently die and did absolutely nothing to help her. Then he desecrated her corpse and had planned on leaving town before officers could locate the remaining body parts inside his freezer. During her final argument, Assistant District Attorney Sabiha Medini presented to the jury grotesque, morbid details of this young woman's murder, including photographs of her decapitated head and limbs, much to the shock and anger of many in the courtroom, especially the victim's loved ones. The jury did not deliver justice that day. For some unexplainable reason, the jurors didn't believe he had committed the crime of intentional homicide. They found him not guilty on charges of second-degree murder. They fell for his lies, his charm, his manipulations, just like Leondra Foster and others had. The jurors believed his manipulative retelling of the story and convicted him of negligent homicide and of concealing the corpse. This brutal killer pimp now only faced the maximum sentence for this crime of 4 to 8 years in prison. So what is defined as negligent homicide? Negligent homicide is when someone's negligence or lack of inaction causes a person's death. The individual's death is a result of another's recklessness, inattentiveness, or outright carelessness. In New York, it carries a maximum of 4 years in prison. This neglect is defined as unintentional, but it involves a substantial deviation from what an otherwise reasonably thinking person would have done under similar circumstances. For example, this could describe an offender who accidentally shoots someone by mishandling a weapon, or a caretaker who leaves a child in a hot car, reckless driving, or if an individual sees someone overdosing or having some other kind of medical emergency and they choose to not get them help. Do any of these examples equate to watching your girlfriend have a seizure after cracking her head on the tub, that is if you buy his asinine story, who then dies? You proceed to chop her into pieces, but keep some for yourself in the freezer at home and then force someone else to help you dispose of the remaining pieces of her at a trash facility. Does that sound to you like the same level of neglect as watching someone die as they overdose or hitting someone with your vehicle because you were texting? Not in my universe, it doesn't. And yet these jurors bought into his unbelievable story, even though he openly admitted to dismembering her, keeping parts of her, and discarding her like garbage. During the sentencing hearing held about a month later, Assistant District Attorney Sabiha Medini read the victim's impact statement, where the family described to the judge how their beloved daughter and sister had been abused, isolated from them, demeaned, and reduced to being the girlfriend of an evil monster. In December 2019, Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Ruth Shillingford sentenced Samari Moses to 2 to 4 years on each count, telling him that it is the court's intention that he serve the longest term of 8 years. Unlike the jury, who didn't seem to acknowledge the depths of his depravity and cruelty shown toward the victim, Justice Shillingford did. She pointed out how, when Samari Moses testified in his defense at trial and discussed casually and nonchalantly how he had abused Leondra Foster as if it's just the way it is, all part of the game, the judge said to him, and I quote, "I suppose that served to dehumanize her when you took 4 hours to decapitate and destroy her." At least Justice Shillingford called him out for the true monster he is. Samari Moses had nothing to say to the family or to the court. The jury's acquittal on second-degree murder charges horrified Leondra Foster's family. Her sister, Shaniqua Figueroa, could be heard screaming through her tears as she ran out of the courtroom, saying, "Oh my God, it's not right. That's not right." Leondra's sister told the media that there were many signs, many red flags around Samari Moses. She claimed that he had threatened to kill her sisters, her mother, her father, her niece, and her. Leondra Foster's family deeply loved her. Her sister was beyond devastated to hear about her death and the heinous acts committed against her. Through her heartbreak, she shared with the media how generous and loving her sister Leondra was to everyone. And I quote, "She always did for others before she did for herself. It's eating me up inside that he did this to her." Leondra Foster's mother spoke about how she sees her daughter and her granddaughter every time she looks at her, and it breaks her heart every time. She said, and I quote, "It's very difficult because my granddaughter looks just like her mother, and every time I look at her, I see my daughter. Leondra's foster, Kenneth Foster, simply stated that Samori Moses was a sadist, with a thing against women. No statement could have been closer to the truth. Samori Moses had been a pimp in New York for several decades and was a registered level 2 sex offender. In 2006, he was arrested for attempting to prostitute an underage girl. He was known for soliciting clients for Leondra Foster, a known sex worker. What wasn't realized initially, though, was how he had manipulated, coerced, abused, and threatened her with violence, which had escalated in the months before she was found dead. It appeared that this was the end of the case, and that this monster had gotten away with her murder and dismemberment. However, over 3 long years, the FBI continued to build its case while he was in prison. They would not give up on bringing justice to Leondra and her family. Now, you may be wondering, how can Samori Moses be tried again for her murder when he was already acquitted by the state? Well, first of all, jurisdiction between federal and state crimes are separate, and therefore a defendant can be tried by both the state and the federal government, whether it is during the same period or, in this case, years later. While Samori Moses was locked up on charges of criminally negligent homicide, dismemberment, and concealment of a corpse, FBI investigators had identified other women he had prostituted and who had faced his wrath for years. With the help of 8 amazingly brave women and girls, they had established how Samori Moses had been forcing these females, and likely many more, to sell their bodies for money through the use of threats to kill them, their children, other family members, and through disturbing acts of abuse and violence. Federal prosecutors also found 2 individuals who would testify that Samori Moses had confessed to them about how he had murdered and chopped up Leondra Foster. Samori Moses, 1 day before he would be eligible for parole, which he could have received, was faced with a 10-count federal indictment, including the forced prostitution of 9 women, including 2 underage girls, through extreme abuse and violence, including the late victim, Leondra Foster. Specifically in count 10 of the indictment, it states that Samori Moses did knowingly and intentionally murder an individual, and that the defendant, with malice aforethought, did unlawfully kill Leondra Foster. On Tuesday, May 18, 2022, official documents were filed with the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York against Samori Moses for murder and for the abuse and torture of multiple women through the course of human trafficking. U.S. Attorney Breon Peace addressed the media saying, "Sex trafficking is a modern form of slavery that uses violence and fear to force vulnerable individuals to work for someone else's profit, in this case resulting in the alleged brutal murder of one of the victims. This office will continue to prioritize investigation and prosecution of these heinous crimes." He, along with Attorney Driscoll, gave high praise and gratitude to the women and girls who bravely provided the prosecution with details of the horrific violence they had suffered at Samori Moses' hands. Under the Federal Criminal Code 2245, Section 1591, murder which occurs during the commission of human trafficking is a capital offense, with the harshest of penalties including life in prison and the death penalty. Forced prostitution or the prostitution of a minor is also considered a federal offense with severe criminal punishment. This was the first time in the United States where murder was criminalized during the course of sex trafficking. Human trafficking is a federal offense, which typically involves methods of fraud, coercion, force, or a combination to obtain labor, commercial sex acts, or other services. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, new amendments included additional criminal provisions and increased possible penalties for laws already in existence. Such methods are not necessary for criminal liability of any person under the age of 18. An individual who, within the course of the offense of human trafficking, murders another shall be faced with incarceration, including and up to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole, and possible death. the day he was officially charged, a powerful letter was sent by United States Attorney Breon Peace to the court with the sole purpose of keeping this man incarcerated until his murder trial. The letter specifically addressed how he posed a significant threat to the community. Samori Moses was a dangerous, violent man who was at high flight risk if released. U.S. Attorney Breon Peace requested that the court keep the defendant in jail before his criminal trial, explaining to them how they had evidence that for more than a decade in Brooklyn and Queens, Samori Moses had viciously and violently forced, at a minimum, 9 women, including 2 underage girls, to perform sex work. The papers acknowledged the severe beating and murder of one of his trafficking victims back in January 2017, Miss Leondra Foster. The letter detailed the recorded incidents of torture and violent abuse these victims suffered at the hands of the defendant, which would later be relied on to support the prosecution's case in court. If this man was released on bond, his victims were terrified that he would come after them. During his initial arraignment, Samori Moses pleaded not guilty to all charges and was held without bail pending his trial. Considering this was a capital murder case, in which murder committed in the course of human trafficking would have led the prosecution to seek the death penalty, Samori Moses changed his mind. He ended up pleading guilty to all charges in September 2023. During his federal criminal trial, the prosecution illustrated how through manipulation and coercion, Samori Moses had been a lover boy to these women. The term lover boy is a popular label for the men who lure in vulnerable females with the promise of love, a great new opportunity in life, sometimes both. And once they achieve their trust, they trap them and force them into a life of prostitution. These men employ various tools of manipulation, psychological and physical abuse, including beatings, rape, torture, and threats to themselves and their loved ones to retain ultimate control and domination over them. When these women attempted to leave or told him they wanted out, they were sick of being sold and their bodies abused. Their cries to be freed were met with the most horrific and sadistic of violence. These traumatized and terrified women would face their monster, this vicious predator, in court. Identifying herself as Jane Doe number 1, one woman told the court how Samori Moses threatened to throw her off the roof, and then after raping her, he bit a piece of flesh from her buttocks and spit it at her. Another of his victims described how when she told him she was done with sex work, Samori Moses pulled out a taser and tortured her with the device until she was completely broken, and finally agreed to do what he wanted to make the pain end. Another woman, identified as Jane Doe number 6, confessed to how Samori Moses whipped her with an extension cord when she disobeyed him and threatened to rub salt on the wounds if she didn't do what he asked. Another of his victims he slashed with a razor blade. She alleged that he cut her arms and back with the blade and then beat her with a belt before dousing her wounds with lemon juice. These acts left this woman permanently scarred. For another victim, known as Jane Doe number 7, torture came in the method of a shotgun shoved into her mouth, with Moses screaming at her that he would kill her and her child. Samori Moses attempted to exert the ultimate domination and control over these women, whom he viewed as nothing but his property, wanting their bodies to be tattooed with his name, Samori. Just like how Leondra Foster's foot had been found inside his freezer, this man was not simply a disgusting, vile pimp who stole their money. He was a violent, sadistic predator who had to be put away for life. This torture and violence committed against these women and girls culminated in the murder of Leondra Foster in January 2017. It was believed that Samori Moses murdered Leondra Foster in the early morning hours of January 13th, 2017. Her autopsy report showed evidence of a severe beating. The victim was covered in bruises and abrasions across her front and back. A minimum of 5 strikes to her head had been made, either directly to or from her head being banged against something. The last and fatal injury was made to the left backside of her skull, which was fractured in the process. Leondra Foster fell unconscious, had a seizure, and died within minutes. The following day, Samori Moses began to dismember her body with a knife and a saw. A woman testified in court as to how she had been invited over to Samori Moses' apartment while Leondra Foster's dismembered body was still there. The woman claimed to have not seen the remains, but observed how the apartment was overwhelming with the scent of bleach. It is unknown why Samori Moses waited 4 days until he got rid of parts of Leondra Foster's body. Maybe he couldn't just let her go. He couldn't even let her have peace in death. He had to be in control even of her corpse, and perhaps wanted to keep parts of Leondra as the ultimate proof of what can happen to a woman who doesn't do as she is told. On April 5th, 2024, Leondra Foster and her family would finally receive the justice they deserved. United States District Judge Carol Bagley Amon sentenced Samori Moses to 10 terms of life imprisonment for the 10 counts of sex trafficking 8 women and for the murder of one of them, Leondra Foster. It is crucial to discuss various components of this case. First, the type of offender Samori Moses is. Secondly, the extremely high risk of violence that women and girls engaged in sex work face, and how human trafficking and prostitution coexist. In terms of criminology, Samori Moses is a narcissist, a sadist, misogynist, and a rapist. Based on the typology of rapists established by Dr. Nicholas Groth and H.G. Birnbaum in 1979, he fits the description of both a power-assertive rapist and an anger rapist. A power-assertive rapist is defined as an offender who uses sexual assault to exert power, dominance, and control over his victims. This kind of rapist tends to be impulsive with their attacks and don't use unnecessary levels of violence. The anger rapist seeks to degrade, humiliate, and demean their victims. They enjoy the power they receive by hurting them. Their assaults tend to be spontaneous, and so the weapons they employ could be anything. They could be their hands or whatever is within their reach. This second profile fits the patterns of behavior shown by the offender Samori Moses, whose acts of torture were extremely brutal, cruel, bizarre, and included both physical and psychological violence. I think he is a combination of these two because his assaults served in his mind a purpose to gain the women's obedience and tear them down so he could program them to serve him. There is something innately evil, to me, more evil than many other crimes, when a person tricks, exploits, coerces, and forces someone to commit acts against their will and nature. Someone who threatens and tortures another person to do what they want so they can benefit from it financially is beyond sadistic. A person who forces another to prostitute themselves for their gain is beyond depraved. Not only do these actions rip away an individual's freedom, dignity, and self-respect, but it also forcefully exposes them to the dark underworld of drugs, pornography, and sexual violence, which exponentially increases their chances of becoming a victim of homicide. Sex work-related females are 60 to 100 times more likely to be murdered than women who are not involved in commercial sex acts. For individuals who participate in sex work, they represent a disproportionate number of the victims of serial killers, especially those who evade capture for many years, sometimes decades. These women's and girls' deaths are often not even investigated, and when they are, very few resources are placed into finding their killer. The term, quote-unquote, less dead is often applied to these women when they are found murdered. This demeaning label is used in journalism as well as in criminal investigations to describe these victims who are considered less important in society. These victims are the marginalized groups of people who draw less interest in the media and whose cases are given lower priority to solve. They're the drug addicts, members of the LGBTQIA community, the homeless, sex workers, the poor, and most minority and ethnic groups also fall into this category. The term sex work versus prostitution alone has been a source of disagreement. In recent years, there has been a relabeling of prostitution to be called sex work instead, implying that it is a form of legitimate, respectable employment. A fascinating and relevant academic paper I read on this topic for this case discussed the conflict surrounding this terminology, and that by using the term sex work, the beliefs and systems behind it remain concealed. Prostitution is a system of violence. The act is based on reducing bodies into a commodity to buy and use as the buyer sees fit. Nothing is empowering or equal about this act. The term sex work associates the belief that it is dignified and valuable like any other form of work. This minimizes, even hides the fact that it is a result of the most serious and horrific violation of human rights. Prostitution and violence against women and girls are intimately related. They are a continuous, endless circle, and one does not exist without the other. Some advocates and scholars have called for the legalization, or at least the decriminalization, of sex-related services to help minimize the crisis of violence and abuse. However, the research conducted on countries that have legalized prostitution have shown conflicting and concerning results. In countries such as the Netherlands, where sex work is legal, they are a country of origin of human trafficking, in addition to being one of the top destinations of human trafficking. A 2023 report showed that of the 845 reported victims of human trafficking, 326 were victims of sexual exploitation. One study showed that there were around 6,250 women and girls being trafficked in the sex trade there, with 1,300 of them being underage. This is strong evidence that legalizing the act of prostitution does not equate to the safety and protection of the workers. Under the guise of legalized prostitution, many human traffickers lure in and trap young women and girls with the promise of real opportunities. They are often led away from Eastern Europe to the Netherlands and other parts of Western Europe with the hopes of leading a better life. Once they land there, their passports are taken from them and they're forced to work. Similar to the vile predator in the case of Leondra Foster and Samori Moses' other victims. These young men are so common within the human trafficking scheme in the Netherlands. These lover boys have specifically been addressed as critical to target and combat within the action plans and anti-trafficking organizations established by the Netherlands government. Now, often the lover boy plays the role of the lure, and their part is complete once they have delivered their victim. But like Samori Moses, sometimes the lover boy also becomes their enslaver. One particular story was shared about a 17-year-old girl in Romania who was lied to by a guy she believed was her boyfriend. He lured her away from her home to London with the promise of a good-paying job. Once she got there, she was sold and forced to work in an Amsterdam brothel. She explains perfectly the problem of legalized prostitution, and I quote, "The problem is that once I was in that brothel, everybody just walked by, smiling and waving or glaring and laughing, including some of the police, because everything was perfectly legal." The patriarchal institutions, which are fueled by racism and male dominance in society, have led these women and girls to feel they have no other options, or they are misled, forced, and become trapped in this dire world. The development of this system of violence has been escalated by industrialization and globalization, where anyone and anything can be bought and sold, including humans. Women and girls who intersect across multiple areas of discrimination and inequality are the most vulnerable to enter, become involved with, and remain in prostitution. Factors of age, race, legal status, disability, social class, sexual orientation, and gender identity only increase the risk of women and girls being engaged with this world. These women and girls are less likely to have access to services or assistance, legal protection, or legitimate opportunities to make a living. The majority of them have been victims of trauma, childhood abuse, including incest, poverty, and substance abuse. Most of them have little to no formal education, but they do have family members, including parents, siblings, and often their own children they need to provide for. Their life experiences and backgrounds lead them to being prone to further exploitation by traffickers and by individuals willing to give them money to perform sex acts. Some women and girls have been sold by their own family members or intimate partners for the sole purpose of sexual exploitation. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, and some individuals do choose to perform this kind of work, whether it is their main source of income or part-time for additional cash, of their own free will. However, the data indicates that for the majority of individuals, especially women, and absolutely for girls not of the legal age who are involved in sex work, it is an outcome of one of two tragic life situations. Prostitution is either a result of coercion or force via sex trafficking, or they are the most marginalized and vulnerable of females in society, who are often homeless drug addicts who turn to selling their bodies to simply survive. Whether they are victims of human trafficking or a combination of bad decisions and terrible life circumstances which have led them to substance addiction, and which sex work helps to support their habit. I don't believe that this is what the majority want to do with their lives. These were not the dreams they had for themselves when they were children. No one chooses to be used, mistreated, degraded, and abused. The data also shows that females who have been victims of sexual abuse are the most likely to be involved in prostitution. The cycle of violence continues for them. For me, the answer lies not within its legalization or decriminalization, so much as within the penalties that are placed upon the individuals who support and perpetuate the violence that exists within prostitution. The males and females who sell their bodies should not be further violated and punished by the legal system, but rather it should be the pimps, traffickers, and individuals who buy other people's sexual services. If clients who purchase sex services faced severe financial consequences and criminal punishment, including incarceration, I have a strong inclination that the interest in buying women and girls' bodies, in addition to men's and boys', would drastically decline. As a result, this would help minimize sex trafficking. There is a misconception that prostitutes are not cared about by anyone in society. They are treated this way by the media, the general public, and too often law enforcement. Some people would go so far to say that these women and men shouldn't have placed themselves in a dangerous situation. That's what happens when you are a junkie, or as if they asked to be abused, tortured, and murdered by being involved in the sex industry by force or choice. But for these individuals' loved ones, their lives are just as valuable as any other victims. And society needs to acknowledge that their loss is just as real and painful. Prostitution is a violation of a female's right to dignity and respect, to all humans' right to dignity and respect. It often involves abuse, rape, gang rape, being beaten up, humiliated, and tortured at the hands of sadists. These can be their clients, their enslavers. Sometimes they are both. Prostitution helps to perpetuate femicide, death threats, and serial murders. It makes you wonder how many male serial killers who have targeted prostitutes over the decades may have never killed at all if it weren't for the way these individuals are perceived and treated by the media and by law enforcement, as if they are disposable. Too often, the mass media, including true crime, ignores these women's stories and the hell they experience because they are seen as partially to blame for their circumstances. Many perceive their lives as less worthy because they are addicted, they are involved in prostitution, they are homeless, less educated, less cultured. But this is judgmental, unwarranted, and disgusting that our society continues to treat them this way. This case is so important because not only did it successfully prosecute a woman's murder and the atrocious abuse and torture of other women and girls under the Criminal Code of Human Trafficking, but it also acknowledged the value of these marginalized women's lives. This case was an exception to the rule, and it made a huge impact on the relationship between law enforcement officers and sex workers in New York. One can only hope that it will inspire change, and other law enforcement officers and its agencies will begin to treat all cases of homicide as equally important to solve. Thank you so much for listening to the tragic story of Leondra Foster and Samori Moses' countless victims of sex trafficking. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. What are your views on this breakthrough case of federal prosecution? What do you think about the legalization of prostitution? Does the answer lie in going after these pimps and treating them under the criminal law as the violent predators and sex traffickers most of them are? If you have any thoughts, comments, or case ideas for future episodes, please reach out. You can find my contact information in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.